You're standing in Kansas, March 1918. The wind cuts through skin, but it's not the cold that kills. It's what's inside the lungs of 100 men who woke up this morning unable to breathe. Fever, cold sweat, coughing that tears pieces from their chests. Within 48 hours, the military hospital at Camp Funston is overwhelmed. Stretchers in the corridors, nurses running between trembling bodies. The smell is of flesh burning from the inside. 3 weeks later, the disease crosses the Atlantic. Not on airplanes, on ships, in the lungs of American soldiers embarking to save Europe. They don't know they're carrying something worse than any German weapon. Within 18 months, 1 in every 3 humans on the planet will be infected. 100 million dead. More than the Black Death. More than both world wars combined. It all started here, in this forgotten military camp in the middle of Kansas. And it all started with a syringe. An experimental vaccine. Thousands of soldiers. A scientist named Frederick Gates sent by the Rockefeller Institute. Nobody asked the men if they agreed. Nobody explained what was being injected into their veins. Just orders. Line up. Arm extended. Needle goes in. Next. What official records called influenza wasn't influenza. What the entire world knows as Spanish flu didn't start in Spain. And what killed 100 million people wasn't an accident of nature. It was an experiment gone wrong. My name is Tom, and you're about to discover the truth governments have hidden for a century. Wait until you know what was in that syringe. Camp Funston wasn't an ordinary hospital. It was a laboratory, a human testing ground disguised as a military base. Tens of thousands of men crammed into wooden barracks, waiting for orders to embark toward France. But before they wore the uniform of heroes, they were something else, guinea pigs. Frederick Gates arrived in January 1918. He wasn't a general. He was a bacteriologist, sent by the Rockefeller Institute with a clear mission: test an experimental vaccine against bacterial meningitis. The disease was killing soldiers in European trenches. The army needed a solution. Gates had a vaccine, he just needed bodies to test it on, and he had thousands at his disposal. The vaccine wasn't simple. It wasn't just attenuated virus or dead bacteria. It was raw biological material extracted from horses infected with respiratory diseases. Lungs from sick animals ground up, filtered, injected directly into the bloodstream of young Americans. Nobody asked permission, nobody explained the risks. Just, this will protect you in the war. Line up. Arm, needle. Next. What Gates didn't know, or chose to ignore, is that horses carry pathogens humans shouldn't touch. Viruses that jump from species to species like sparks on dry gunpowder. And when you inject that directly into the blood of thousands of men, in a confined space, with immune systems already weakened by extreme military training, you're not creating immunity. You're creating a biological bomb. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, America was selling the world the image of savior. Uncle Sam pointing his finger. I want you. Posters of smiling soldiers, liberating heroes, marching to save Europe from tyranny. But here in Kansas, these same heroes were treated like laboratory rats. Their bodies didn't belong to them. They belonged to the army, to the government, to military science that answers no questions. And then it began. First there were 10 cases, then 50, then hundreds. Sky-high fever, coughing up blood, lungs flooded with fluid, men drowning in dry air. Doctors called it unusual flu, made notes in reports, filed the documents, and kept injecting, because the war couldn't wait. And soldiers were expendable. But here's the part that will make you furious. When the disease exploded globally, killing millions, nobody called it American flu. Nobody called it Kansas flu. They called it Spanish flu. Why? The answer will show you how governments rewrite history to protect their secrets. April 1918. The disease has already crossed the Atlantic. American soldiers disembark at French ports, coughing up blood. Military hospitals in England begin registering severe atypical pneumonia. German troops in the trenches fall by the thousands, not from bullets, but from fever. And all governments do the same thing. Absolute silence. United States, France, United Kingdom, Germany. Enemy countries at war but allies in the cover-up. Total censorship. Newspapers forbidden from mentioning the epidemic. Reporters threatened. Military doctors instructed not to use the word epidemic in public reports. The logic was simple and brutal. Troop morale. If soldiers knew they were dying more from disease than combat, the war machine would stop. Recruitment would plummet. Mothers would hide their sons. Truth was a greater threat than any enemy army. But there was a problem. A country that wasn't at war. A country whose press was still free. Spain. Neutral in the conflict, Spain had no reason to censor its news. When the disease arrived in Madrid in May 1918, Spanish newspapers did what newspapers should do. They reported. Cases by the thousands, hospitals overflowing. And then the final blow. King Alfonso III fell ill. Global headlines. King of Spain, bedridden by mysterious disease. Epidemic devastates Madrid. Lethal flu ravages Spain. The world read, and the world blamed Spain. Not because the disease started there, but because it was the only country honest enough to admit it existed. While America hid corpses at Fort Riley, while France burned medical reports, while Germany lied about its casualties, Spain told the truth, and was punished for it. The name stuck. Spanish flu. Sealed in history. Even today, a century later, when you hear about the 1918 pandemic, you think of Spain. Not Kansas, not Frederick Gates, not syringes filled with biological material from sick horses. You think of bullfights and paella and a bedridden king. That's the magic of war propaganda. You don't need to lie. You just need to control who speaks. Spain was punished for telling the truth. America was protected by hiding it. And 100 million people died, never knowing where the bullet that hit them came from. But wait, there's something that still doesn't make sense. Flu has existed for millennia. Colds kill the elderly and babies, not healthy young people. So how the hell did a common respiratory disease kill more people than the Black Death? The answer lies in biology. And it's absolutely terrifying. The darkest theory was never officially confirmed, but the data doesn't lie. Gates's vaccine contained biological material from infected horses, equine viruses, respiratory bacteria, foreign proteins injected straight into human bloodstream. When you do this on an industrial scale, two things can happen. First, mutation. A horse virus learns to live in humans. Second, catastrophic immune reaction. The human body panics, doesn't recognize the invader, and destroys itself trying to fight it. Both happened. Now imagine 2 million soldiers, all vaccinated, all boarding overcrowded military transport ships, holds without ventilation, men sleeping in bunks stacked inches from each other, breathing the same recycled air for weeks. Each cough was a biological fragmentation bomb. Each sneeze spread the mutant virus across dozens of bodies around. The ships weren't troop transports. They were floating incubators, and when these men disembarked in Europe, they found the perfect environment to transform an epidemic into apocalypse. Trenches, mud up to their knees, contaminated water, rats the size of cats running between corpses, toxic gases burning soldiers' lungs week after week, chronic malnutrition, extreme psychological stress. Men who hadn't slept in days, who lived in constant terror, whose immune systems were already on their knees before the virus even arrived. And then it arrived. But here's the real horror. What made the 1918 flu different from any other flu in history? It killed the strong, not the old, not babies, young people between 20 and 40 years old, healthy men, athletes, soldiers at the peak of physical fitness. They woke up with fever. By 6 in the evening, they were blue. By midnight, dead. The cause? Cytokine storm. Their bodies detected the invader and released all defenses at once. The immune system went into overdrive. Uncontrolled inflammation flooded the lungs with fluid. The pulmonary alveoli, those microscopic sacs where oxygen enters the blood, became waterlogged, drowning on dry land. The stronger your immune system, the faster you died. Your own body was the weapon. The same men sent to save Europe from Germany carried death with them, not in rifles, in lungs. And when governments finally realized the magnitude of what was happening, when they saw entire cities being decimated, when civilian hospitals began stacking corpses in refrigerated warehouses because cemeteries couldn't keep up, it was too late. The disease had wings. and the world was about to learn the true meaning of the word pandemic. March 1918, first wave. Doctors confused it with common flu, high fever, cough, fatigue, nothing that rest couldn't cure, low mortality. Concerning but not apocalyptic, governments breathed relieved. Maybe that was all. A seasonal outbreak, another medical statistic to file and forget. They didn't understand they were watching the rehearsal. The real show would begin in August. Second wave, August to December 1918. The virus returned, but it wasn't the same anymore. It had mutated. H1N1, a strain that attacked differently, killed differently, spread differently, and this time it spared no one. India, 17 million dead. Not in years, in months. Entire villages wiped off the map, families decimated in days, crematoriums working 24 hours without stopping, and still bodies accumulated in the streets. The smell of burning flesh mixed with incense couldn't mask the odor of decomposing death under the equatorial sun. Brazil, Rio de Janeiro, 15,000 dead in 3 months. Horse-drawn carts collecting corpses at dawn. Coffins piled in cemeteries because there weren't enough gravediggers. Rich families paying fortunes to ensure their dead weren't thrown into mass graves. Poor families watching their loved ones stacked like firewood. Samoa, 22% of the population, decimated. 1 in 5 Samoans dead in weeks. Entire generations of elders erased. Oral knowledge, traditions, stories, all lost because there was no one alive to transmit them. South Africa, the gold mines of Johannesburg became underground mortuaries. Thousands of black workers confined in overcrowded dormitories, without ventilation, without medical care. They descended to extract wealth from the earth and came up dead. Mine owners didn't stop production, they just replaced the bodies. There were always more desperate men looking for work. And while this happened, while the planet bled, world leaders signed armistices, victory parades, speeches about peace and reconstruction. Presidents and prime ministers smiling for photographs, waving flags, promising a glorious future. And backstage, behind the cameras, gravediggers worked 24 hours a day, without pause, without rest, digging holes faster than the earth could absorb the dead. 100 million people, erased, while the world pretended to celebrate. But here's the part that gives you chills, that turns your stomach. They knew. Governments knew. The military knew. Reports crossed desks of generals and ministers showing the real numbers. And they chose silence, because admitting the truth would mean admitting guilt. And guilt demands consequences. The reports existed. Military documents dated March 1918, signed by Fort Riley doctors, describing in detail an unusual and highly contagious respiratory disease, infection graphs, abnormal mortality rates, patterns that didn't make sense for common flu, all archived, all stamped, classified. For 50 years, these documents remained locked, away from historians, away from journalists, away from families who lost grandparents, parents, children, and never knew why. Frederick Gates, the man who held the syringe, was never called to testify, never answered questions. Continued his career at the Rockefeller Institute as if nothing had happened. Died in 1929 of natural causes, in his bed. No trial, no investigation. Not a single line in his obituary mentioning Fort Riley or experimental vaccines. The 1918 autopsies were rediscovered in 2008. Lung tissue preserved in formaldehyde, forgotten in basements of military hospitals. When scientists finally analyzed the samples, they confirmed mixed bacterial and viral origin. Exactly the type of infection that emerges when you inject contaminated biological material into thousands of humans. The World Health Organization only recognized Fort Riley as a possible point of origin in 2014. 96 years later, no official apology, no compensation for descendants, no memorial plaque in Kansas saying, "Here began the greatest pandemic in modern history. 100 million dead, 0 trials, 0 consequences, 0 admission of guilt. Just silence. The kind of silence governments have perfected over centuries. The kind of silence that protects institutions but buries truths. And the worst part? The system that allowed this, that turned soldiers into guinea pigs without consent, that classified evidence for half a century, that never held anyone accountable. That system wasn't dismantled. It still exists. It just changed its name. Fort Riley should have been the end, should have taught the world that human beings aren't laboratory material, that national security doesn't justify turning citizens into guinea pigs, that secrecy kills as much as bullets. But it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Tuskegee, 1932. 400 black men, mostly illiterate, infected with syphilis, left without treatment for 40 years, observed like rats, studied while they rotted from the inside out. All in the name of science, all under supervision of the American government. MK Ultra. 1953, CIA administering LSD and experimental drugs to citizens without consent, prostitutes drugging clients for observation, psychiatric patients used as tests, memories erased, minds destroyed, documents burned when the press started asking questions, radiation tests, 50s and 60s, prisoners, soldiers, children with mental disabilities exposed to radioactive material to measure effects, without warning, without protection. Cancers blooming decades later, while scientists noted results on clipboards. The same logic in all cases. National security above transparency. Greater good above individual dignity. Scientific results above human ethics. And today? BSL-4 laboratories manipulating pathogens, gain-of-function research creating more lethal versions of viruses, debates about accidental leaks that governments deny before even investigating. The language changed. The justifications became more sophisticated, but the structure identical. The Spanish flu wasn't a natural tragedy. It was a tragedy of arrogance, of men who believed they knew more than nature allows, of institutional secrecy that protected the guilty and buried truths, of impunity that taught subsequent generations that you can kill millions and die old, rich, and respected. I'm Tom, and I need to know, if you could ask one question to those responsible for Fort Riley, to the generals who approved the injections, to the bureaucrats who classified the documents, to the scientists who never admitted guilt, what would it be? Because these questions matter, not just to understand the past, but to not repeat the future. Now tell me, does your family have any story from the time of the 1918 flu? Someone who survived against all odds? Someone they lost and never forgot? Share in the comments. These stories cannot be erased, because when we forget the dead, we kill them a second time, and nobody deserves to die twice.